So you played in England, you said?
Marquee, we played three nights, about 2 months ago. And it was insane. And we got there having really no idea of what the response, because our EPs did really well over there before the album. And we get there, and so we go to the sound check the first night. You know, it's like 3 in the afternoon, actually. There's a line of kids 2 blocks down, you know, all knowing who we were, and we're going, oh no. So, yeah, so all...
Great. We had to have our security guards, right? I mean, this is, for us, it's like, we just hang out. We don't need security people and shit. We're not used to that, right?
It's a real joke to us, actually.
Rather, right? Anyway, so we go out and we go to hang out in London, right? And it's like, all these kids are coming up and they're asking for autographs, and they want their asses signed, and they want their chest signed.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, whoa.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome to GNR Central. And today I want to do an episode about something I've been dying to talk about for a long time. Now, when you think of Guns N' Roses' greatest gigs, probably a lot of those dates from the Use Your Illusion tour come up. But really one of the most important set of dates that Guns N' Roses played in their career really started out in the UK before the band even broke big across the pond or even in the US. So almost 4 months or 3 months before Appetite for Destruction came out, it was May of 1987, and Guns N' Roses' manager at the time, Alan Niven, was instituting a plan that he had been working on in the music business ever since Jimi Hendrix was brought to London in the last months of 1966. Niven was hoping that if British audience could get behind Guns N' Roses, who was the latest US sensation, then they could get some cachet to travel back across the Atlantic and offer some glamour to otherwise familiar local boys. He said, in terms of development of the band, it was key to my strategy that we connected well in the UK. Now, it was about creating a perception that it was not just a bunch of Hollywood F-ups, it was a band that had international appeal. So it was also time for another Alan Niven masterstroke. So he struck a deal with Geffen president at the time, Eddie Rosenblatt, to personally distribute all 10,000 copies, records, and cassettes of Live Like a Suicide EP. Then Niven turned up in a van to pick them all up. Eddie told me later, when I loaded that van up and disappeared down the road, he rather wondered if he'd ever see me again. Niven would end up selling the lot to an independent distribution company called Important and picked up a check for $42,000. Then he went back to Eddie Rosenblatt with the check. I pulled it out and waved it at him behind his desk. He went to hold it and I pulled it away from him and I said, "This takes us to England." And he sat there and looked at me for a moment and I said, "This pays for our first trip to England, okay?" And he goes, "Okay." And I gave him the check, and that's how he paid for the first three Marquee shows. Now, the Marquee was an emblematic rock dive in London's Wardour Street. Now, since the dawn of the 60s, every major rock artist from the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix to David Bowie and the Sex Pistols had played there. Getting Guns N' Roses to play the first shows outside America there was a major coup, the kind of the outside-the-box thinking that would earmark GNR as somehow different, smarter, and cooler than a lot of their LA contemporaries. So it was essential for me to bring them to England, Niven says. Faster Pussycat were also recording their major label debut, LA Guns were not far behind, and other West Hollywood charmers like Jet Boy were snapping at their heels. It gave me a clear message: get ahead of the pack. So to help set the scene for their London debut, Geffen brought some of the British rock press to LA. Now, Sounds magazine was a really inky weekly known, unlike its more illustrious rivals Enemy and Melody Maker, for its uninhibited love of hard rock and heavy metal. They carried out the first UK interview with Guns N' Roses, and the band bemoaned what they saw as a fake LA scene, Axl taking a chance to stick a knife into Poison, and Slash claiming that Van Halen was the only real rock band to emerge from the city. Now, you guys may not know this, but Jeff and I interviewed Paul Elliott. He was the guy who interviewed Guns N' Roses for Sound magazine back in 1987. Here's what he had to say about interviewing the band for the first time.
So can you tell us about, like, when was the first time you met Guns N' Roses? Because the one thing I really love about your book is that you take us, you know, at least in the beginning parts, it's basically told through your eyes, because you hung out with the band early on before Appetite came out, and you sort of tell the story from your perspective, and not so much from referencing articles as much from like a lot of the other books I've read.
Journalist at the time, yes, I did spend time with Guns N' Roses, because they didn't, as you guys know it, they didn't do that many interviews.
No.
Axl, very, very few. So it's a kind of a weird thing to think now, because, I mean, I'll give you the story of how I accepted that job, shall I?
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
So my editor at the time, I mean, this is when I'm still not making enough money out of writing in 1987. I've been doing it for 2 years, less than 2 years. And what the magazine said, look, in the best possible sense, don't give up the day job. So I carried on working at a garden centre, right? 4 days a week. And while I'm working at the Garden Centre, I'm still walking around there with a pen and paper in my back pocket because I'm thinking of ideas about, I'd be sitting out the back there with a Walkman on, listening to Slippery When Wet, trying to review it while working at the Garden Centre. So anyway, on one day, the phone rings, and when I worked at the Garden Centre, they would have to ring me there to see if I could go and do a job for the magazine. So they called me and said, do you want to go and do this new band called Guns N' Roses? And I'd read Xavier Russell's review in Kerrang about them, calling them lines and noses and wine and poses and all of this. And I looked at the photos and I thought, it's just another lame LA hair band, right? Why would I think anything different? And then I did hear that EP and I thought, whatever. It's got 2 covers on it. So that's...
Yeah. So live like a suicide you're talking about.
Yeah, live like a suicide. So it's not telling me much, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's Mamakin. It's not as good as Aerosmith's version, in my opinion. And there's Nice Boys, which is, I think it's a tremendous, Steven Adler is at his best on that track.
Right.
And, so I like the way they were going. I mean, Rose Tattoo and Aerosmith, that's great. But I didn't think it was the second coming by any stretch of the imagination. But what I did was that I knew Slayer, Rain and Blood had come out at the end of '86, but it was the most controversial thing that had ever happened in, heavy music for so long. And I wanted to interview them. And I knew that if I went to LA, I could get them. So I accepted a trip to go and do Guns N' Roses on the understanding that if I got there, I could track down Slayer. And I was more interested in speaking to them. And then obviously my priorities changed during that trip, because there is the moment in the book that I talk about when we do the interview with Guns, and then at the end of that interview, Slash says, you haven't really heard anything off the album, have you? And I went, well, no. So he said, well, listen to this. And it was the days of the original Walkman.
Mm-hmm.
So he just stuck the headphones onto my head, and he played me one song, and it was It's So Easy. And obviously at that point, I'm presuming that my jaw had dropped so far down towards the floor because he just stood there laughing. And I sort of went, oh my God, it's the moment every music journalist dreams of. I have stumbled inadvertently into the world of the greatest rock band on the planet.
So you're one of the first people to ever hear the final cut of It's So Easy.
Yeah, I mean, we heard that, and then the following day, just after hearing that we went down and did the photo session that was with my sounds feature. There's some of the outtakes from that in the book. I know you see the black and whites of them when they're at the Hell House.
Yeah, the Hell House, I remember that.
Yeah, and so those are the shots, and one of those shots obviously was used in the booklet for Appetite, and the back cover, obviously not the
collage on the back.
Yeah, not the Robert John shot, but the Greg Freeman shot that is, the beer kegs in the photo and everything, and the malt liquor sign. So, that's where that was done. And while they were doing that photo shoot, they were playing the rest of the album, just the rough mixes. And obviously I'm hearing these songs properly then. And and it was playing on Duff's, what was referred to as a ghetto blaster in those days, was just blasting it on his thing. And by the time we'd done an hour of doing the photos around that house and I'd heard those tracks, I mean, I was pretty convinced that, by an incredible stroke of luck, I was right in there with, what I considered to be on that show the best band in the world.
So one thing I love about the story is when you were doing that photo shoot, isn't this when the police pulled up? And that's where they got the shot in front of the police car.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were getting a lot of trouble. They were moaning about the amount of trouble they'd had because it was this really strangely dilapidated place down off. I don't know. I mean, I didn't know my LA geography very well then, so it was down below Santa Monica. And anyway, we were in this place. It wasn't the nicest looking place you've ever been. The street was, you could imagine, it was I think fairly affluent. So what they didn't want was these bunch of maniacs in this. It's like the old Lemmy joke about if Motorhead moved in next door to you, your lawn would die. And I'm sure the neighbors felt that about Guns N' Roses. And so, listen, when I went to take a piss when I was in their house, I mean, I was stepping over needles on the floor, and it was a decadent scene. But what went with that was the amazing music. And I mean, literally, it's hard to. We all know Appetite so well now. It's hard to. I mean, just try and take yourselves back to that moment.
Now, if you guys have been with us for a long time, or maybe you're a new subscriber, then maybe you haven't seen our interview with Arlette Vericke. Now, she used to be the publicist for Guns N' Roses from 1987 to 1992, and she was in London for those Marquee shows, and she recalled what happened in the run-up to those shows. And
now, you mentioned the Marquee show.
Yes.
Everybody on the planet who is a fan of this band wants to know, and since you were there and you have firsthand knowledge, was the show videotaped?
Not officially by no one. Not officially. If somebody taped it, it was not official. Don't forget, when we came to London, nobody knew who they were. That was not like a big deal. We had 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to promote it before the shows. So I said to the guys, we all stayed in an apartment together that has since not been rented out to any one band. And I said, okay, let me go and see what the record company's got. I'll see if I can work with them on things. If not, I'll do it myself. So the record company, number one, was not aware of who Guns N' Roses was. In England, it was Geffen. It was Warner Brothers at the time. Geffen was distributed by Warner Brothers. Mm-hmm. And they had no interest in them. They had set up for the 3 weeks we were there. They wanted us to do some local stencils. Do you know what a stencil is?
Yeah.
They had like 3 stencil magazines set up for us. And I said, no, I reject it, don't want it. I said, if you can do better than that, don't worry about it. Just give me an office and I'll come and make my phone calls here because we didn't have a budget. And I said, I'll do it myself. So I called all my press people and I said, listen, I don't bullshit people. If I don't like it, I will tell you, this is what you need to hear. This is what you have to concentrate on. So we took them out, drank with everybody. I invited everybody to our apartment, set up the interviews. Some of them went a little bit wrong because of the word F-U-C-K, too much used at that time. And I made a deal with the girl who worked there at the marketing. I said, you pay for my booze and I'll introduce you to everybody you need to know. She was new there. So I used to go to Warner Brothers and she used her budget on buying us booze. So I used to go like I was pregnant with my leather jacket with all the booze under it because we had only $5 a day. Yeah, and they can't do anything without booze. So I said, I'm going to liquor them up. So I used to get all their bread, whatever was in the kitchen at Geffen, I took. So at that time, we were so well done. And at one point, there was an incident that happened with Warner Brothers. The first Marquee show, before the Marquee show, I took Slash with me to Warner Brothers. I said, some of us have to go and shake hands because this is not happening here. I said, come with me. I'll introduce you. They'll be scared of you, so it's fine. So Slash and I walked in there, scared of Axel went also the day before to shake hands with people. I got in there and she said to me something like, she introduced me to her boss, and this is Arlette, she's with Motley Crue. And I was like, is she hallucinating or what is this? So
even before Guns N' Roses hit the UK, there was newspapers warning about how much of a corrupting influence the band was going to have on the nation's youth. So in one newspaper, there was a warning from the Daily Star that declared a rock band even nastier than the Beastie Boys is heading for Britain. The story that appeared in the Star was a piece of classic tabloid sensationalism, and they basically referenced a joke that Axl made. Axl said, I quote, "I hate poodles, everything about them makes me want to kill them." The paper introduced the band by stating, Los Angeles-based Guns N' Roses are led by the outrageous Axl Rose, who has an endearing habit of butchering dogs. It continued by saying the other members of the group were sleazy as their crackpot leader. Guitarist Slash and bass player Duff McKagan claim that they have been on a boozing binge for 2 years. Says Slash, when we get up in the afternoon, we can't play because our hands are shaking like windmills. Guns N' Roses arrived in London for 3 shows at the Marquee. So the first show took place on June 19th, and then the other 2 took place on the 22nd and 28th. Now the band was jet-lagged, hungover, testy, and some of them not long out of rehab. For Slash, it was a return to a country he barely remembered, and when he was in a state to remember anything. The others had never left America. Alan Niven and Tom Zutaut, both far more worldly than the rest of the band, at least in terms of culture and travel, were soon dealing with the same kind of shit they got into in LA. Duff threw Steven up against the wall for making stupid remarks about Robert John, who'd paid his own way on the trip and who was the band's photographer at the time. Slash arrived in the midst of a 5-day bender and needed 2 days sleep. He got drunk again at a party to celebrate the release of Bob Dylan's film Hearts of Fire and caused a ruckus. Axl had a brief scuffle with security staff at the Tower Records after he felt faint from the effects of antihistamine tablets and a lack of sleep and sat on some steps unwilling or unable to move when requested. So the growing fractiousness was in fact part due to the desire of Guns N' Roses to prove themselves. They were in the city of the Rolling Stones and the Sex Pistols, and the infamous UK press were primed and ready to take down the latest bunch of LA wannabes as they saw it. But the London branch of Geffen was basically behind them in a way that the US branch could not be. They had issued a limited edition AA side of It's So Easy and Mr. Brownstone, knowing that it had really had no chance of radio play. But as their label manager Joe Balsam told Mick Wall, we knew the music press would pick up on it, which they did, and they would reinforce the band's reputation as being wild and out there, so it did its job. It also sold quite well. We have only pressed about 10,000 copies initially. Now, before the band's first show at the Marquee, before a packed Friday night crowd, Alan Niven gave the band a pep talk. He said, I sat those little effers down and I said, listen, they're going to look at you like a bunch of LA wankers. They're going to test you. They're going to spit on you. They'll yell at you. And if you blink, you're effing dead. You give it as good as you get. And God bless the Marquee audience. That's exactly what happened. Until Axl and Duff threatened to come off stage and screw around with a couple people. And from that moment on, it was a love affair. Now, it was the band's London agent, John Jackson, who came up with the idea of doing the first Marquee, then leaving it for a few days until the weekly music press came out. Now, everybody in the band had been predicting a huge first show and something that would be really successful, but that wasn't necessarily the case. So whether it was the pressure or just being jet-lagged or the history or the disorienting effect of being thousands of miles from home, the first Marquee show was a flop, a real stinker. The band was spit on, they had beer glasses thrown at them, and the reviews were fairly poor. Poor reviews appeared in both Kerrang and Enemy just a few days later. The Enemy review was written by a distinguished journalist named Steve Sutherland, who would go on to edit the paper, but nonetheless was no particular fan of LA rock in general or of whatever Guns N' Roses were doing. Now, Axl took the review personally. He rang the office of Enemy and threatened to visit Sutherland, who later wrote that he took an early lunch as a precaution. More hurtful to Rose was because he knew in his heart it was true, and Xavier Russell's review for Kerrang, which said plainly that Guns N' Roses blew it pure and simple, although Russell, who had heard an early tape of Appetite, mitigated his critique by calling the record truly wonderful and speculating that the performance may have been different had the crowd not thrown beer cans, could have thrown the band off. Now, as Axl himself would tell McWall when they returned to tour in the UK a few months later, it was the first magazine that really came out and supported us big time. When you said we were good, I believed you guys. So if you say a gig sucks, I believe that too. Now here's the rest of the interview with Arlette Vriki, where she talked about how the band reacted to their first negative review, the first show they played at the Marquee.
We invited a bunch of people from Sounds and Kerrang and all these big rock magazines from England to the show. The first show comes up and the review comes out in Sounds that says Axl sang like he had only one ball. So Axl said, what are we going to do about it? I said, I don't know. You tell me and I'll do it. And he said, let's go and piss on his desk. Can you set that up? I said, sure. I said, this is what I'll do. I'll go to Warner's and I'll get you a taxi at their expense. You go to Sounds and I'll get somebody inside there to find out that the guy is there. So then you walk in and piss on his desk and I'll have a taxi waiting outside and we go back. So it was all set up, but Warner Brothers somehow got wind of it. So they said, if you have any influence with this band, you will stop this nonsense. I said, I can't. I paid for the taxis. And that was it. I was done. I could not do it. So the second day of the show, it was a week later, we went back to Warner's, Slash and I went to Warner's, and we walked out, and they still didn't know what they looked like, really. You know, it's not, it was before the video age and cell phones, whatever. So I walked past the Marquee and there was a line around the corner. And Slash said, is there a show tonight? Should we go? I said, let's find out. So we walked up to some people and said, hey, who's playing tonight? They said, oh, we're waiting for a ticket for an American band, Guns N' Roses. And we just stood there and said, oh, okay then. And we just left and said, oh my God. So we knew we did it, you know. It was lines around the corner and it just went uphill from there.
So after that gig and that impression, did you have an immediate focus on them? And did you think that this band was just going to knock down doors and kick everybody's ass along the way?
I knew that when I heard their first tape. I said to Slash at the time, when he was looking to move in with me because he had no place to live, and he said, you can live with me until you sell 1 million records.
So the band actually had 2 more gigs to turn things around, and that's what they did. So Axl's friend Del James and the band's friend Todd Crew, who is now the former Jetboy bassist and Slash's drug buddy, arrived in town and the Guns Gang mentality basically kicked in. The final show in particular was a triumph for the band. The band added epic new versions of AC/DC's Whole Lotta Love and Bob Dylan's Knocking on Heaven's Door to the set, and Kerrang, showing its faith in the band by commissioning another review, said they were raw, savage, furious, basically emotional, dangerous, rebellious, vibrant, hungry, intoxicating, firmly in the tradition of the Stones, Aerosmith, Rose Tattoo, Sex Pistols, Motorhead, and AC/DC, it almost yelled. Now the band returned to LA better, wiser, and a little more aware of how wide the world was. So that does it for today's video, guys. If you guys haven't seen our Lad Varicki interview or our Paul Elliott interview, go YouTube them and find them. They're about 1.5 to 2 hours in length. They're great interviews. There's probably a lot of stuff you haven't heard before about Guns N' Roses in those discussions. So thanks for watching, guys. Hit the like button and be sure to subscribe if you love GNR as much as I do. And go check us out on GNRCentral.com for the latest Guns N' Roses news. Take care.
Hey, this is Dizzy Reed from Guns N' Roses, and you're watching GNR Central. Yeah!